Listen closely to the quietest moments of the night, and you might just hear it, a deep, slow, and rhythmic heartbeat echoing beneath the vast, sleeping expanse of the North American continent. Long before the first cobblestones were laid in Boston, long before the midnight lanterns flickered in the harbors of the eastern seaboard, and long before the ink dried on the thick parchment of the Declaration of Independence, a profound and ancient story was already unfolding in the absolute silence of the American West. It is a story written not with quills or printing presses, but with the slow, unstoppable forces of glaciers, the quiet accumulation of falling snow, and the mesmerizing power of the earth itself. It is a history that slumbers beneath the soil of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho, holding secrets so astonishing that when they first reached the ears of the modern world, they were dismissed as the fevered dreams of exhausted travelers. But this world was real, and it was quietly waiting to be discovered. To understand the sheer magnitude of this hidden American history, we must travel back through the corridors of deep time, far beyond the memories of any human being. We must strip away the modern highways that ribbon across the Great Plains, erase the distant glow of city lights, and quiet the hum of modern life, leaving only the sound of the wind sweeping through the valleys of the Rocky Mountains. Over 50 million years ago, this land was a sprawling subtropical paradise. Picture a calm, endless forest where giant redwood trees, sycamores, and magnolias stood like silent sentinels under a warm, hazy sky. There was no winter here, only the gentle patter of rain on broad green leaves and the distant low rumble of the earth settling into its new shape. But the North American continent is restless, forever shifting in its sleep. Deep beneath the crust, a massive plume of superheated magma was slowly pushing its way upward, a subterranean giant looking for a way to breathe. Over millions of years, this immense heat triggered volcanic eruptions of a scale that the human mind can barely comprehend. The sky rained soft gray ash for months at a time, burying those lush, ancient forests under thousands of feet of volcanic debris. But rather than being destroyed, something miraculous happened to those trees. As the silica-rich ash settled around them, it dissolved in the groundwater, slowly seeping into the very wood itself. Cell by cell, the organic material was replaced by quartz and amethyst. The trees were turned entirely to solid stone, perfectly preserved in their original upright positions. Even today, if you were to walk through the remote, quiet ridges of what is now Yellowstone National Park, you would find these petrified forests standing in silent testament to a world that vanished millions of years ago. They are the stone ghosts of the ancient American landscape, keeping watch over the valleys below, their wooden rings completely transformed into dazzling, silent crystals. As the millions of years ticked by like a slow-swinging pendulum, the climate of the earth began to cool. The warm, hazy skies faded into a crisp, piercing blue, and the great Pleistocene Ice Age descended upon North America. Imagine a silence so profound that the only sound for 1,000 miles is the slow, agonizing creak of blue ice advancing across the continent. Massive glaciers, some over a mile thick, carved their way down from the northern latitudes, grinding against the granite peaks of the Rockies. These rivers of ice moved at a glacial pace, inch by inch, year by year, scraping out the deep U-shaped valleys and carrying boulders the size of houses as if they were nothing more than pebbles. When the earth finally began to warm again and the glaciers retreated, they left behind a sculpted masterpiece, a vast, rugged, and hauntingly beautiful wilderness. They left behind crystal-clear alpine lakes that mirrored the sky, sprawling meadows of sweet-smelling sagebrush, and deep, echoing canyons where rivers ran cold and clear. The stage was finally set, bathed in the quiet golden light of the American sunset, waiting for the first human footprints. Those first footprints belonged to the ancient ancestors of the Native American tribes. For over 10,000 years, the Shoshone, the Bannock, the Blackfeet, and the Crow moved softly across this majestic landscape. They understood the deep rhythms of the earth, treating the land with a profound, quiet respect. Among them were the Tukudika, often called the sheep-eaters, a peaceful and isolated group of Shoshone who lived high in the remote mountain ranges. They moved like shadows through the thick forests of lodgepole pine, following the migrations of the bighorn sheep. They built gentle fires that crackled softly in the night, the wood smoke rising toward a sky dense with cold, glittering stars. They knew the secrets of the steaming valleys, the places where the earth still breathed hot, sulphurous air, and where water erupted from the ground in towering pillars of white steam. They viewed these geothermal wonders not with fear, but with a quiet, spiritual reverence. It was a sacred place, a place of healing and mystery, where the veil between the physical world and the spirit world was as thin as the morning mist rising off the boiling rivers. They took only what they needed, crafting magnificent arrowheads from the black, glassy obsidian that had cooled from the ancient lava flows. The chips of obsidian fell softly into the snow, the only evidence of their passing in a world that remained overwhelmingly silent. Thousands of miles to the east, however, a very different kind of world was rapidly taking shape. By the early years of the 19th century, the young United States of America was a bustling, noisy strip of civilization clinging to the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. Cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston were growing, filled with the clatter of horse-drawn carriages on cobblestone streets, the ringing of blacksmith anvils, and the continuous hum of commerce. The people of the East looked out toward the setting sun and wondered what lay beyond the dense forest of the Appalachian Mountains, beyond the wide, muddy waters of the Mississippi River. The West was a vast, blank space on their maps, a mysterious canvas onto which they projected their wildest imaginations. Some believed it was a barren desert, devoid of all life. Others thought it was a land of mythical creatures, where woolly mammoths still roamed the deep valleys and mountains, were made of pure, sparkling salt. In the year 1803, President Thomas Jefferson sat in his quiet, candlelit study in Washington, D.C., a scratching quill in his hand, finalizing a transaction that would change the course of American history forever. With the Louisiana Purchase, the United States acquired an astonishing 828,000 square miles of territory from France, instantly doubling the size of the nation. Yet, no one in the American government had ever seen this land. It was a massive, uncharted wilderness bought unseen, a breathtaking expanse of prairies, mountains, and rivers that stretched out into the unknown. Jefferson, driven by an insatiable curiosity and a deeply logical mind, knew that he had to send someone to walk into that blank space on the map. He needed quiet, observant men to chart the rivers, study the plants, meet the indigenous tribes, and find a navigable water route to the Pacific Ocean. And so, the Corps of Discovery was formed, led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. On a mild day in May of 1804, a small fleet of wooden boats slipped quietly onto the Missouri River, leaving the safety of St. Louis behind. For the men of the expedition, the journey was an immersion into a profound, almost overwhelming silence. As they pushed their boats against the slow, muddy current of the Missouri, the familiar sounds of Eastern civilization faded away entirely. There were no church bells, no factory whistles, no calling of merchants. There was only the rhythmic splash of their oars, the deep, mournful calls of the loons at dusk, and the gentle rustle of the wind blowing through the cottonwood trees that lined the riverbanks. Day after day, month after month, they moved deeper into the heart of the continent, watching the landscape change from the lush, green forests of the east to the endless rolling sea of prairie grass that turned silver in the moonlight. As they traveled, the men documented everything with a meticulous, quiet dedication. By the flickering light of campfires, while the rest of the camp slept deeply under the vast dome of the western sky, Lewis and Clark filled their leather-bound journals with tiny, neat handwriting. They described the towering herds of bison that moved like dark clouds across the plains, their hooves making a sound like distant, continuous thunder. They sketched the delicate leaves of new botanical discoveries, pressing them gently between the pages of their books. They noted the weather, the temperature, the direction of the wind, attempting to capture the wildness of the American continent and put it into neat, orderly rows of ink. It was a slow, methodical unraveling of a mystery, a calm and deliberate effort to understand the scale of their own country. But as they traveled through the high plains of what is now Montana, they unknowingly passed just north of the greatest geological secret on the continent. They saw the towering peaks of the Rocky Mountains. They felt the bitter sting of the western winter, but they never ventured far enough south to see the steaming valleys and the boiling rivers that the Native Americans knew so well. The great Yellowstone caldera, the sleeping giant beneath the earth, remained hidden from them, cloaked in its own dense pine forests and swirling mists. However, there was one man on the expedition who would soon break away from the safety of the group and walk directly into that mystery. His name was John Colter. Colter was a true American frontiersman, a man who found comfort in the extreme solitude of the deep wilderness. He possessed a quiet, stoic demeanor and an uncanny ability to survive in a landscape that was entirely indifferent to human life. In the late summer of 1806, as the Lewis and Clark expedition was happily returning down the Missouri River, heading back toward the comforts of home and civilization, they encountered two independent fur trappers heading in the opposite direction, toward the unknown. These trappers were looking for someone to guide them into the deep mountains to hunt for beaver pelts. Colter, listening to the rushing water of the river and looking back at the rugged, untamed mountains fading in the distance, made a decision that is still quietly astounding to this day. After spending more than 2 years surviving the harshest conditions imaginable, after traveling thousands of miles and finally being just weeks away from a soft bed and a warm meal, Colter asked for his discharge from the United States Army. He collected his small, meager pay, turned his back on the boats heading east, and walked alone back into the immense, silent wilderness. It was in the bitter, freezing winter of 1807 that John Coulter's journey became something of an American legend, a story that blends perfectly into the quiet, surreal atmosphere of a deep sleep. Armed with only a single-shot flintlock rifle, a 30-pound pack of supplies, and a pair of traditional snowshoes, Coulter set out alone to make contact with the various Native American tribes to establish fur-trading alliances. His path took him south, deeper into the rugged Absaroka Range in the Teton Mountains than any European American had ever gone. Imagine the profound isolation of that walk. The winter in the northern Rocky Mountains is a majestic, silent force. The temperature drops far below zero, freezing the moisture in the air until the sky glitters with tiny ice crystals, a phenomenon known as diamond dust. The snow lay 6 feet deep, a pristine, unbroken blanket of white that absorbed every sound. The only noise was the rhythmic, soft crunch of Coulter's snowshoes breaking the crust of the snow, step after slow step, mile after exhausting mile. The pine trees were heavy with snow, their branches bowing deeply toward the earth. The air was so cold that every breath felt sharp, snapping in the lungs, leaving trails of white vapor that vanished quickly into the vast, empty sky. In this overwhelming white silence, a solitary man walked through a landscape that looked as though it had been frozen in time since the dawn of creation. As Coulter trudged further into a region now known as the Yellowstone Plateau, he began to notice something deeply unsettling, yet strangely beautiful. The freezing, crisp scent of the pine forest was suddenly laced with a sharp, heavy odor, the unmistakable smell of sulfur. As he crested a snow-covered ridge, the freezing wind whipping at his face, he looked down into a valley that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. In the dead of winter, surrounded by miles of deep, frozen snow and ice, the valley below was completely free of winter's grip. Instead of snow, the ground was colored in vibrant, swirling shades of rust red, mustard yellow, and deep emerald green. Thick white clouds of steam billowed up from the earth, rolling lazily into the freezing air like the smoke of 1,000 hidden campfires. Rivers of water, not frozen but boiling hot, cascaded over rocks, sending up warm, humid mist that collected on the nearby pine needles and instantly froze into delicate, intricate icicles. The ground itself seemed to tremble slightly beneath his boots, emitting a low, continuous rumble, punctuated by the violent, sudden hiss of steam escaping from narrow vents in the crust. He watched in quiet astonishment as a pool of crystal-clear water, so blue it looked as though it had been painted, suddenly began to boil violently before erupting hundreds of feet into the freezing air, a majestic column of boiling water suspended in the winter sky. Coulter stood alone, a solitary speck in the vastness of the American wilderness, witnessing the earth breathe. He was standing on the thin, fragile crust of one of the largest active supervolcanoes on the planet, a place where the ancient subterranean heat we spoke of earlier was meeting the freezing water of the Rocky Mountain winter. The contrast was hypnotic. The absolute quiet of the snow-covered peaks was perfectly balanced by the rhythmic, soothing, continuous bubbling of the hot springs and the soft hiss of the steam vents. It was a place of extreme violence and extreme peace, existing simultaneously in the deep silence of the wilderness. For weeks, Coulter wandered through this surreal, dreamlike landscape. He walked past bubbling cauldrons of thick, gray mud that popped and gurgled with a slow, mesmerizing rhythm. He navigated around deep thermal pools that dropped away into absolute darkness, the water so incredibly hot that it dissolved the very rock around it. He slept in the warm soil near the vents, using the earth's ancient heat to keep himself from freezing in the brutal nighttime temperatures, the steam wrapping around him like a warm, comforting blanket, while the temperature just a few yards away plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. It was a serene, otherworldly existence, completely disconnected from the bustling cities of the East Coast, where people were drinking their morning tea and reading newspapers, completely unaware that such a fantastical place actually existed on their own continent. When the spring thaw finally came, the snow melting into rushing icy creeks that cascaded down the mountainsides, Coulter made his way back out of the mountains. He arrived at a small, remote trading post on the Bighorn River, thin, exhausted, and carrying a story that was simply too incredible to be believed. When he sat by the fire, nursing a hot cup of black coffee, and spoke in his quiet, deliberate voice about a place where water boiled straight out of the snow, where the earth rumbled and shook, and where the smell of brimstone filled the air, the other trappers simply laughed. They thought the brutal winter and the profound isolation had finally broken his mind. They jokingly called the place Coulter's Hell, a myth, a tall tale spun by a lonely man who had spent too much time in the cold. But Coulter's Hell was not a myth. The stories of this steaming, bubbling wonderland became a quiet whisper that floated through the smoky taverns of St. Louis and the crowded streets of New York. The whisper was carried on the wind, passed from trapper to trader, from trader to merchant, a slow, persistent rumor of a magical place hidden deep within the American West. The wilderness, with its vast plains, its towering mountains, and its hidden breathing valleys, was patiently waiting to reveal the next chapter of its astonishing history. The deep, rhythmic heartbeat beneath the rock continued to pulse, slow and steady, echoing through the canyons and the silent forests, waiting for the time when the rest of the world would finally come to see it. The rumors of John Coulter's steaming, bubbling wonderland drifted back to the crowded, noisy streets of the eastern seaboard like a slow, hazy dream. As the years quietly turned into decades, these whispered tales of boiling rivers and towering fountains of water settled into the collective imagination of the young United States as nothing more than the entertaining fabrications of lonely men. The people of New York, Philadelphia, and Boston would listen to these stories by the warm, flickering light of their hearths, chuckling softly before turning down their oil lamps and drifting off to sleep. They went about their busy lives, laying down brick and mortar, building a nation of industry and commerce, completely unaware that the vast, silent wilderness of the American West was patiently keeping its greatest masterpiece hidden under a blanket of pristine snow and whispering pine trees. For nearly half a century after Coulter's solitary walk, the great Yellowstone Plateau remained largely undisturbed, locked in a profound and majestic slumber. Time moved differently out there. It was not measured by the ticking of grandfather clocks or the ringing of factory bells, but by the slow, rhythmic changing of the seasons. Imagine the deep, hypnotic peace of those untouched years. Winter would descend upon the Rocky Mountains with a gentle, suffocating quiet. Millions of soft, heavy snowflakes would fall through the still air, piling up in the branches of the lodgepole pines until the boughs bowed down touching the frozen earth. The geysers continued their ancient, mesmerizing dance completely unobserved. They would rumble softly beneath the thick ice, sending warm vibrations through the frosted soil before erupting into the frigid air, their towering plumes of steam transforming into delicate, glittering diamond dust that drifted lazily across the empty, white valleys. When the brief, brilliant flash of summer finally arrived, the valleys transformed into a lush, emerald paradise. Elk and bison grazed slowly through the tall, sweet-smelling sagebrush, their massive heads dipping down to the earth in a slow, rhythmic motion. The only sounds were the gentle buzzing of the cicadas in the warm afternoon sun, the distant, muffled roar of the waterfalls carving their way through the deep canyons, and the soft rustle of the wind sweeping across the endless prairie. It was a landscape breathing deeply, existing in a state of perfect, uninterrupted calm. Into this vast, quiet world came a new breed of American explorer, the mountain men. Throughout the 1820s and 1830s, these solitary, fiercely independent trappers pushed their way deeper into the uncharted territories of the West, seeking out the quiet streams and hidden valleys where the beaver were plentiful. They were men of few words, individuals who found peace in the overwhelming solitude of the wilderness. They dressed in heavy, fringed buckskin, carried long, heavy rifles, and rode slowly on the backs of sturdy, sure-footed horses. Among these quiet wanderers was a man named Jim Bridger, a legendary figure in American folklore whose life story reads like a long, slow lullaby of the frontier. Bridger was a quiet observer, a man who could read the landscape like an open book. He learned the subtle languages of the forest, the meaning behind a snapped twig, the shifting of the wind, and the changing colors of the sky at twilight. In the 1830s, his slow, wandering path led him up into the high country, right into the heart of the slumbering supervolcano. Like Coulter before him, Bridger stood in absolute awe of the steaming earth. He spent months exploring the hidden valleys, listening to the soothing, rhythmic bubbling of the paint pots, watching the mud boil and pop with a slow, mesmerizing cadence. He rode his horse gently to the edge of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, a massive, yawning chasm carved into the earth, where the rock walls were stained in magnificent, sleep-inducing shades of pale yellow, rust red, and burnt orange. He watched the massive river tumble over the lower falls, a sheer drop of over 300 feet, the water crashing into the deep pool below with a continuous, heavy roar that echoed through the canyon walls like the deep breathing of a sleeping giant. But Jim Bridger was a storyteller at heart, and when he finally rode his tired horse back down out of the mountains and into the dusty, rowdy trading posts of Missouri, he could not keep the silence of the wilderness to himself. As the fire crackled and the wood smoke filled the room, Bridger would speak in a slow, mesmerizing drawl, weaving tales of a land where waterfalls flowed upward, where rivers ran so hot you could cook a trout without taking it off the line, and where entire forests, right down to the leaves and the birds in the branches, had been turned to solid, glittering stone. His stories were beautifully, impossibly grand, and because they were so grand, the American public, rooted in the logical, pragmatic world of the mid-19th century, simply smiled, nodded gently, and wrote them off as Bridger's lies. They believed he was spinning tall tales to pass the long, dark nights. Newspapers of the era gently mocked him, refusing to print his accounts, believing that such a fantastical, dreamlike place could not possibly exist within the borders of their sensible, growing nation. And so the great Yellowstone Plateau rolled over and went back to sleep, its secret safe once more behind the towering, silent walls of the Rocky Mountains. While the mountains slept, the rest of the United States was beginning to stretch and move with a slow, unstoppable momentum. The 1840s and 1850s brought the era of manifest destiny, a quiet but powerful belief that the American people were meant to settle the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This era ushered in one of the most hypnotic, rhythmic migrations in human history, the journey of the wagon trains across the Oregon and California trails. Imagine the slow, heavy progress of those covered wagons known as prairie schooners. They looked like small white ships floating slowly across a vast, endless sea of green and golden grass. The canvas covers would billow gently in the continuous prairie wind, a soft, snapping sound that became the lullaby of the plains. The journey was measured not in miles, but in months. It was a life dictated by the slow, deliberate plodding of massive oxen. Step by heavy step, their hooves churning the dry earth into soft ribbons of dust that hung lazily in the warm summer air. The wooden wheels of the wagons turned with a continuous rhythmic squeak, a sound that, over 2,000 miles, simply blended into the quiet background of the wilderness. The pioneers walked alongside the wagons, their boots sinking softly into the soil. At night, they would draw their wagons into a protective circle, a small island of humanity in an ocean of absolute darkness. The campfires would be lit, small flickering points of orange light under a canopy of stars so dense and bright it looked as though someone had spilled sugar across black velvet. The sounds of the night camp were gentle, the soft lowing of the tired oxen, the quiet strumming of a fiddle playing a slow, mournful tune from the old country, and the hushed murmurs of parents putting their exhausted children to sleep under thick, heavy wool blankets. These massive trains of humanity passed hundreds of thousands of people right through the heart of the American West. They crossed the dusty plains of Nebraska, forged the shallow, braided waters of the Platte River, and struggled over the steep, rocky passes of the Continental Divide. Yet, despite this massive migration, the hidden wonders of the Yellowstone region remained completely untouched. The trails lay to the north and to the south of the high, impenetrable Absaroka Plateau. The pioneers, exhausted by the relentless, slow march toward the setting sun, had no energy to detour into the rugged, uncharted mountains just to chase a mountain man's ghost story. They kept their eyes fixed firmly on the horizon, seeking the rich, fertile valleys of Oregon, or the glittering gold fields of California, leaving the steaming, hissing dreamscape of the high country to slumber in perfect peace. Then came the dark, heavy years of the 1860s. The United States, a nation that had been slowly building its identity, was suddenly torn apart by the terrible, violent storm of the Civil War. The cannons roared, the muskets flashed, and the fields of the East and the South were soaked in tragedy. But out west, in the deep, remote valleys of the Rocky Mountains, that terrible storm was nothing more than a faint, distant whisper carried on the wind. The mountains did not care about the quarrels of men. The geysers erupted with the exact same majestic rhythm The pine trees dropped their needles softly into the pristine snow, and the grizzly bears lumbered slowly into their dens for the long, deep winter sleep. The wilderness maintained its absolute indifferent tranquility, waiting patiently for the storm to pass and for the nation to heal. When the heavy smoke of the Civil War finally cleared, a new, quieter era began to dawn over the American West. The Transcontinental Railroad was slowly pushing its iron rails across the plains, an artery of steel connecting the East Coast to the West Coast, bringing with it a renewed curiosity about the blank spaces left on the maps. It was time, finally, to wake the sleeping giant. It was time to separate the myths from the reality, to see if the ghost stories told by men like John Coulter and Jim Bridger held any truth in the cold, clear light of scientific observation. In the late summer of 1869, the first deliberate attempt to map the region was quietly organized by three men: David Folsom, Charles Cook, and William Peterson. They were not heavily armed soldiers or loud, boisterous glory seekers. They were quiet, thoughtful men, carrying simple surveying equipment and a deep sense of respect for the unknown. They rode slowly up the Yellowstone River, their horses stepping carefully over the smooth, round river stones. The water rushed past them, cold and crystal clear, born from the melting snow of the high peaks. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner, crisper, and carried the heavy scent of pine and a faint, curious hint of sulfur. When they finally breached the perimeter of the plateau, they were struck speechless. They rode slowly into the lower geyser basins, their horses snorting nervously at the strange, warm mist rising from the earth. They walked softly across the delicate silica-crusted ground, feeling the deep, continuous rumbling of the ancient supervolcano vibrating up through the soles of their boots. They sat for hours in absolute stunned silence, watching the great fountain geyser send a magnificent boiling column of water hundreds of feet into the blue sky. The water hung there for a long, breathless moment, catching the golden light of the late afternoon sun before crashing back down to the earth in a brilliant shower of steam and mist. When the Folsom Cook expedition returned to civilization, they were deeply changed men. They had seen the dream, and they knew it was real. But much like Bridger, when they tried to publish their quiet, meticulous journals, magazine editors politely declined, stating they did not want to ruin their reputations by printing such obvious works of fiction. The truth of the American wilderness was simply too magnificent, too surreal, to be easily believed by those who had never felt the slow, heavy heartbeat of the high country. But the seed of truth had been planted, and it slowly began to sprout. The following year, in 1870, a much larger, more official group, known as the Washburn-Langford-Doane Expedition, was formed in the quiet, dusty frontier town of Helena, Montana. This group consisted of prominent citizens, surveyors, and a small military escort led by Lieutenant Gustavus Doane. They were determined once and for all to pull back the heavy blanket of myth and reveal the true face of the Yellowstone Plateau to the United States. Their journey was a slow, majestic procession into the heart of the mystery. It was late August, the time of year when the heat of the summer begins to gently fade, and the cool, crisp breath of autumn begins to whisper through the aspens, turning their small, delicate leaves into shimmering coins of pure gold. They rode in a long, quiet line, the leather of their saddles creaking softly, the horses' hooves making a dull, rhythmic thud against the dirt trails. For weeks, they moved in a state of continuous, quiet astonishment. They documented the massive, boiling mud pots that popped and hissed with a thick, heavy sound, like a massive cauldron of oatmeal slowly cooking over a low fire. They measured the depths of the crystal-clear thermal pools, where the water was so pure it appeared to be a bottomless abyss of sapphire blue, framed by delicate, brightly colored rings of heat-loving bacteria that looked like a carpet of crushed autumn leaves. One evening, as the sun began to slowly sink below the jagged peaks of the western mountains, painting the sky in deep, sleepy shades of bruised purple and heavy, rich crimson, the expedition made camp in the upper geyser basin. The men were exhausted, their muscles aching from the long day in the saddle. They unsaddled their horses, letting them graze peacefully in the tall, sweet grass. They gathered dry, gray sagebrush and built a small, warm fire that crackled softly, pushing back the gathering chill of the evening. As they sat there, sipping hot black coffee from tin cups, staring into the mesmerizing, glowing orange embers of the fire, they suddenly heard a deep, powerful roar. They turned their heads to see a massive pillar of boiling water and white steam erupting directly in front of the setting sun. It was a perfectly timed, flawlessly majestic performance, a display of pure, unbridled natural power that seemed entirely indifferent to their presence. The men watched in quiet awe as the water arched against the twilight sky, because it seemed to erupt with such a comforting, predictable rhythm. They decided right then and there to name it Old Faithful. That night, under the immense, heavy canopy of the western stars, as the steam from Old Faithful drifted over their camp like a warm, protective fog, a profound conversation took place around the dying embers of the fire. The men spoke softly, their voices blending with the gentle hiss of the thermal vents. They realized that this land was too unique, too powerful, and too sacred to be subjected to the loud, destructive forces of modern progress. They imagined what would happen if the miners came with their pickaxes and dynamite, tearing open the delicate geyser basins in search of gold. They pictured the loggers chopping down the ancient, silent forests, leaving the majestic landscape scarred and barren. In that quiet, historical moment, sitting in the absolute center of the American wilderness, a revolutionary idea was born. It was an idea that had never been conceived of anywhere else in the history of the world. They proposed that this land should not be owned by any single man. It should not be chopped down, dug up, or fenced off. Instead, it should be protected forever, held in a quiet, permanent trust for the benefit and the enjoyment of all the people. It was the genesis of a dream that would eventually echo across the entire globe, the idea of a national park. As the fire slowly burned down to soft gray ash, the men wrapped themselves tightly in their heavy wool blankets, pulling their hats down over their eyes. The deep, rhythmic breathing of the sleeping giant beneath them hummed through the soil, a constant, comforting vibration that slowly lulled them into a deep, dreamless sleep. The great wilderness had finally been discovered, but instead of being conquered, it had quietly conquered the hearts of the men who found it. The next chapter of this incredible sleeping history was about to begin, setting the stage for an unprecedented preservation of the American landscape. When the dawn slowly broke over the upper geyser basin the morning after that historic campfire, the air was bitterly cold and completely still. The Washburn-Langford Doane expedition awoke to find their heavy wool blankets coated in a delicate, shimmering layer of white frost. The breath of the horses plumed in the freezing morning air, soft white clouds that hung momentarily before dissolving into the vast, clear blue of the Wyoming sky. The men packed their camp with a quiet, deliberate reverence, their movements slow and heavy. As they tightened the leather cinches on their saddles and kicked dirt over the soft gray ashes of their fire, the earth beneath their boots gave a familiar deep rumble, Old Faithful, right on its majestic ancient schedule, sent another towering column of boiling water into the crisp morning light, a final spectacular farewell to the men who had just promised to protect it forever. The journey back to the noisy, bustling civilization of the East Coast was a slow, methodical transition. They rode out of the high country, leaving the hissing steam vents and the vibrant, bubbling mud pots behind, returning to the sprawling, dusty plains of the Montana Territory. But the silence of the wilderness had deeply permeated their souls. They carried the heavy, magnificent secret of the Yellowstone Plateau with them, not as a conqueror's prize, but as a quiet, sacred trust. When they finally boarded the steam trains heading east, the rhythmic, metallic clatter of the iron wheels on the steel track felt harsh and jarring compared to the soothing, continuous whisper of the wind through the ancient lodgepole pines. As the winter of 1870 settled over the United States, cloaking cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C., in thick blankets of gray snow and coal smoke, the members of the expedition began their quiet campaign. They sat in drafty wood-paneled parlors and gas-lit lecture halls, speaking in calm, measured tones to anyone who would listen. They told the politicians, the businessmen, and the newspaper editors about the dream they had under the stars, the dream of a massive, protected public park, a sanctuary of nature held in trust for the American people. But the halls of Congress were loud, busy, and entirely focused on the heavy, pragmatic burdens of rebuilding a fractured nation after the Civil War. To the pragmatic minds of the lawmakers, the idea of setting aside 2 million acres of prime, unexplored Western real estate simply to protect a few boiling springs and pretty waterfalls seemed like a foolish, romantic fairy tale. They listened politely, their heavy leather boots resting on polished oak desks. But they demanded something more than just the beautifully written words in a frontiersman's leather-bound journal. They needed absolute, undeniable proof. The wilderness, it seemed, would have to be captured and brought back to the crowded, noisy streets of the capital. This monumental task fell to a man named Dr. Ferdinand Vanderveer Hayden. Hayden was a geologist, a man of profound patience and quiet, methodical observation. He understood the deep, incredibly slow forces that shaped the earth, forces that took millions of years to carve a canyon or raise a mountain range. In the spring of 1871, armed with a modest appropriation from the United States government, Hayden began to assemble a scientific expedition unlike any that had ever ventured into the American West. He knew that to convince the skeptical minds of Congress, he could not just bring back rocks and topographical maps. He needed to bring back the very soul of the landscape. He needed to capture the hypnotic, dreamlike atmosphere of the steaming valleys, the sheer, terrifying depth of the canyons, and the blinding, vibrant colors of the thermal pools. To do this, Hayden made a brilliant, quiet decision. He hired 2 artists to accompany his team of rough, hardened surveyors and scientists. One was a brilliant, meticulous photographer named William Henry Jackson. The other was an eccentric, visionary landscape painter named Thomas Moran. The Hayden expedition moved across the western plains with the slow, heavy rhythm of a fully loaded freight wagon. It was a massive undertaking, a caravan of mules, canvas-covered supply wagons, and men on horseback, kicking up a slow-moving cloud of golden dust that drifted lazily across the prairie. By midsummer, they reached the towering, silent walls of the Rocky Mountains and began the arduous climb into the high country. As they crossed into the Yellowstone Basin, the air grew incredibly thin and carried that familiar sharp scent of pine and ancient subterranean sulfur. For William Henry Jackson, capturing the sleeping history of the Yellowstone was a process of agonizing, beautiful slowness. In the late 19th century, photography was not the quick, instantaneous click of a modern camera. It was a heavy, physically demanding, and deeply chemical art form known as the wet plate collodion process. Imagine Jackson's quiet, meticulous routine whenever the expedition reached a magnificent vista, perhaps the edge of a roaring waterfall, or the rim of a steaming geyser basin. Jackson would set up a heavy, light-proof canvas tent, essentially a portable darkroom, right there in the rugged wilderness. Inside the suffocating heat of the dark tent, breathing in the sharp, sweet smell of ether and alcohol, Jackson would carefully take a flawless pane of heavy glass. With incredibly steady, slow hands, he would pour a thick, syrupy mixture of collodion over the glass, tilting it gently until the surface was perfectly coated. Then, in absolute darkness, he would plunge the sticky glass into a bath of silver nitrate, making it sensitive to the light. He had to work while the plate was still wet, a window of only a few agonizing minutes. He would place the dripping glass plate into a heavy wooden holder, step out of the dark tent into the blinding mountain sunlight, and load it into his massive wooden large format camera, which was perched atop a heavy wooden tripod. Jackson would then compose his shot, staring completely upside down and backward through the frosted glass of the camera's viewfinder. He would wait for the absolute perfect moment. He waited for the wind to stop blowing so the pine trees wouldn't blur. He waited for the thick, white steam of the geysers to billow in just the right direction, catching the slanting golden rays of the afternoon sun. And then he would gently remove the lens cap. For several long, silent seconds, he would stand completely still, holding his breath, allowing the light of the American wilderness to burn its majestic image onto the silver-coated glass. He would then replace the cap, rush the heavy plate back into the dark tent, and pour the foul-smelling developer over it, watching in quiet, mesmerizing awe as the image of the sleeping giant slowly appeared on the glass, a permanent, undeniable record of a world that most Americans thought was entirely fictional. While Jackson captured the sharp, monochromatic reality of the landscape, Thomas Moran captured its vibrant, impossible colors. Moran was a small, quiet man, entirely unused to the rough, saddle-sore reality of frontier life. He rode a small, sturdy mule wearing heavy wool clothing that swallowed his thin frame. But when he dismounted and set up his wooden easel on the rim of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, a profound transformation took place. He would sit for hours in absolute silence, completely absorbed in the hypnotic rhythm of the plunging river far below. Moran would mix his watercolors with slow, deliberate strokes. He looked at the towering, jagged walls of the canyon and saw colors that defied the logical, pragmatic minds of the East Coast. He painted with sweeping washes of bright sulfur yellow, deep rusted iron reds, and soft crushed velvet purples. He captured the dark emerald green of the lodgepole pines, contrasting sharply against the brilliant blinding white of the tumbling waterfalls. The scratch of his brush against the heavy, textured watercolor paper was the only sound he made, a soft, rhythmic sweeping that blended perfectly with the distant, continuous roar of the falls. He wasn't just painting a picture. He was translating the deep, emotional impact of the wilderness onto a piece of canvas, capturing the sleepy, overwhelming awe of a landscape that had existed in complete isolation for millions of years. As the weeks slowly turned into months, the expedition moved deeper into the heart of the caldera. They walked carefully around the edges of the Grand Prismatic Spring, the largest hot spring in the United States. Imagine standing on the soft, silica-crusted edge of this massive pool. The steam rising from the surface was thick and warm, wrapping around the men like a heavy, comforting blanket, carrying the deep, earthy smell of the planet's interior. The water in the center of the spring was a blue so pure, so incredibly deep and vibrant, that it looked as though you could fall into it and drift downward forever. Surrounding this deep blue eye were hypnotic, radiating rings of magnificent color. The heat of the water supported vast, blooming mats of microscopic thermophilic bacteria, creating perfect, sweeping bands of bright yellow, vivid orange, and deep, rusted crimson. The color slowly shifted and pulsed in the rising steam, creating a mesmerizing optical illusion that made the entire earth seem as though it were gently breathing. The men of the Hayden expedition simply sat on the ground, completely captivated by the slow, silent majesty of the spring, watching the colors shift in the afternoon light until their eyelids grew incredibly heavy. It was a place that commanded absolute tranquility, a place where the chaotic, noisy rush of human history seemed entirely irrelevant. By the time the first heavy snows of autumn began to fall, softly coating the colorful hot springs and the dark green pines in a pristine layer of white, the expedition had gathered their evidence. They carefully packed Jackson's fragile, irreplaceable glass negatives into heavy wooden crates packed with soft sawdust. They rolled up Moran's vibrant watercolor sketches, protecting them from the damp, freezing air. They turned their horses eastward and began the long, slow ride back to civilization, carrying the undeniable truth of the Yellowstone Plateau saddlebagged across their weary horses. When they returned to Washington, D.C. in the freezing gray winter of late 1871, they did not just bring back a report. They brought back a visual masterpiece. Dr. Hayden, moving with the quiet, determined pace of a man who knows he is holding a royal flush, set to work. He didn't just hand his scientific findings to the distracted, overworked members of the United States Congress. He completely surrounded them with the wilderness. In the grand, echoing halls of the Capitol building, Hayden set up a quiet, mesmerizing exhibition. He displayed William Henry Jackson's large, incredibly detailed black and white photographs on the heavy oak tables of the committee rooms. The lawmakers, men in dark, heavy wool suits, smelling of cigar smoke and damp wool, would stop their loud, argumentative debates and gather around the photographs in complete silence. They stared at the frozen, towering column of Old Faithful, permanently caught in mid-eruption. They traced the deep, terrifying lines of the canyon walls with their fingers. They saw the vast, perfectly calm reflections of the sky in the glassy surface of the thermal pools. And then they saw Thomas Moran's massive, sweeping watercolor paintings. The brilliant, impossible colors splashed across the canvas finally made the lawmakers understand the sheer, breathtaking scale of the land. The quiet, visual testimony of Jackson and Moran achieved what words alone could never do. It bypassed the logical, argumentative parts of the lawmakers' brains and spoke directly to a deep, quiet sense of awe. The heavy, noisy machinery of the United States government, a machinery built on the principles of manifest destiny, industrial expansion, and the relentless extraction of natural resources, slowly ground to a complete halt. The members of Congress, usually so divided by the bitter, lingering hatreds of the post-war era, found themselves quietly united by the sheer beauty of a landscape they had never even seen. They realized with a profound, slow-dawning clarity that if they did not protect this land, it would be destroyed. The timber companies would eventually chop down the silent ancient forests to build railroad ties. The mining conglomerates would blast the delicate geyser basins into dust, searching for veins of silver and gold. The magnificent, hypnotic thermal pools would be fenced off, turned into cheap, noisy tourist attractions, their pristine beauty lost forever to the loud, clanking march of progress. And so, with a remarkable, quiet swiftness, the United States Congress drafted the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act. The language of the act was simple, beautiful, and deeply profound. It stated that the massive 2-million-acre tract of land at the headwaters of the Yellowstone River would be dedicated and set apart as a public park or pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. Furthermore, the act strictly mandated the preservation from injury or spoliation of all timber, mineral deposits, natural curiosities, or wonders within said park, and their retention in their natural condition. It was a revolutionary, unprecedented concept. The government was willingly, deliberately, choosing to leave a massive portion of its own territory completely untouched, allowing it to continue its deep, ancient slumber without the noisy interruption of human industry. The bill passed completely through both the Senate and the House of Representatives with remarkably little debate. The undeniable truth of the landscape, captured on glass plates and watercolor paper, had rendered all arguments completely silent. The final critical step in this incredibly slow, methodical journey took place in a quiet, heavily draped room in the White House. It was March 1st, 1872. The winter wind howled softly outside the thick glass windows of the executive mansion, rattling the panes with a gentle rhythmic insistence. Inside the warm, quiet office, a heavy coal fire glowed a steady, comforting orange in the marble fireplace. President Ulysses S. Grant sat behind his massive, carved oak desk. Grant was a man who had seen the absolute worst, most chaotic, and deafeningly loud aspects of human nature during his years commanding the Union Army. He was a quiet, introverted man who often sought solace in the silent company of his horses, a man who deeply understood the heavy, exhausting toll of destruction. On his desk lay the heavy parchment of the Yellowstone Protection Act. The room was completely silent, save for the slow, hypnotic ticking of a large grandfather clock in the corner, its heavy brass pendulum swinging back and forth with a steady, soothing rhythm. Grant picked up a sleek, steel-nibbed dip pen. He dipped it slowly into a heavy glass inkwell, the black ink pooling perfectly on the tip of the metal. He leaned forward, the leather of his chair creaking softly, and with a few deliberate scratching strokes of the pen, he signed his name to the bottom of the document. That simple, quiet sound, the scratching of a pen on thick paper, was the culmination of millions of years of geologic history, the freezing, solitary walks of mountain men, the quiet observations of explorers around a crackling campfire, and the meticulous, slow work of artists in the wilderness. With that single fluid motion, President Grant drew an invisible protective boundary around the sleeping giant of the American West. He created the very first national park in the entire history of the world. Back out west, thousands of miles away from the quiet office in Washington, the Yellowstone Plateau remained completely indifferent to the stroke of the president's pen. It did not celebrate. It did not change its ancient slow rhythms. As the date of the signing passed, a heavy late winter snowstorm was gently blanketing the high country. Millions of massive, perfectly formed snowflakes fell silently through the dark green branches of the lodgepole pines, piling up in deep, soft drifts across the sprawling open meadows. A solitary herd of bison moved incredibly slowly through the deep snow, their massive, heavy heads swinging back and forth, pushing the white powder aside to reach the sweet, dry grass hidden beneath. In the upper geyser basin, the hot springs continued to bubble and hiss, sending warm, comforting clouds of thick white steam up into the freezing, snowy air. The boiling water cascaded over the delicate, intricate terraces of travertine rock, a gentle, continuous splashing sound that blended perfectly with the soft, rushing whisper of the falling snow. Old Faithful gathered its massive subterranean strength, the deep rumbling vibrating through the frozen earth, and erupted with a majestic, roaring plume of water, completely unseen by any human eyes, a magnificent performance played only to the silent, watching trees and the heavy gray sky. The dream of the campfire had become a reality, but the early reality of Yellowstone National Park was far from the orderly, well-managed sanctuary we know today. In its quiet infancy, the park was completely wild, incredibly isolated, and utterly devoid of any real government support. Congress, having drawn the invisible line on the map, provided absolutely no money to actually manage or protect the vast wilderness. They appointed Nathaniel P. Langford, one of the original dreamers from the Washburn expedition, as the park's very first superintendent. He was given no salary, no staff, and no legal authority to enforce any rules. He was simply a man with a title, tasked with guarding a 2-million-acre expanse of extremely rugged, mountainous terrain. For the first several years, Langford, who affectionately became known as National Park Langford, could do little more than sit in his office far away from the park and write quiet, impassioned letters begging for funds. The vast distances and the harsh, unforgiving weather meant that the park essentially governed itself. It was a slow, sleepy transition period. A few rugged, adventurous travelers began to slowly make their way into the region, traveling for weeks over deeply rutted wagon trails, bouncing slowly over the sagebrush plains. They came on horseback and in heavy, jolting stagecoaches, seeking the soothing, healing properties of the hot springs and the absolute, overwhelming quiet of the deep woods. These early visitors experienced a wilderness that was pure, raw, and deeply tranquilizing. They camped under the massive canopy of the stars, their campfires the only pinpricks of light in a vast ocean of utter darkness. They fell asleep to the mournful echoing howls of the timber wolves and the gentle, continuous rustle of the wind moving through the millions of pine trees. The park was slowly entering a new phase of its long sleeping history, a delicate balance between the pristine, untouched wild and the creeping, inevitable edge of human curiosity. The story of the American West was shifting, transitioning from an era of solitary mountain men and slow-moving wagon trains into an era of deep, institutional protection. The majestic, breathing landscape of the Yellowstone caldera had been saved, locked away in a permanent, quiet trust. But as the 19th century slowly began to wind down, drawing to a close like the final glowing embers of a long-burning fire, new challenges and new caretakers would have to emerge from the silence to keep the park from falling into the hands of those who still wished to exploit its hidden wonders. The ink on the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act had long since dried, locked away in the quiet, dim archives of the nation's capital, but out in the vast, breathing expanse of the American West, the wilderness remained completely unaware of its new, protected status. The 1870s and early 1880s drifted over the Rocky Mountains with the same slow, hypnotic rhythm that had governed the land for millions of years. The snows fell in heavy, silent sheets. The geysers erupted with a continuous, majestic punctuality, and the ancient forests of lodgepole pine swayed gently in the continuous, sweeping winds. But a slow, creeping change was beginning to edge its way into the profound silence of the high country, as the romantic, sweeping tales of the park's wonders spread across the rapidly industrializing United States. The newly completed railroads began to deposit a steady, slow-moving stream of curious travelers at the edges of the pristine wilderness. Without any funding from Congress, and without a single ranger to guard the 2 million acres of rugged terrain, the park was completely vulnerable. In this long, quiet vacuum of authority, opportunistic men began to slowly chip away at the edges of the sleeping giant. They were not loud, conquering armies, but quiet, persistent shadows moving through the trees. Market hunters crept through the deep snows of winter, their heavy rifles echoing with a dull, distant thud across the frozen valleys as they decimated the slow-moving herds of elk and the few remaining majestic bison. Souvenir hunters, driven by a quiet, selfish curiosity, took heavy iron chisels and slowly, methodically, broke off the delicate, perfectly formed scalloped edges of the hot springs, packing the colorful silica-crusted rocks into heavy canvas sacks to sell in the bustling, noisy train stations of the East. The pristine, untouched dream of the park was slowly, quietly being dismantled piece by piece under the vast, indifferent gaze of the western sky. By 1886, the situation had become a quiet crisis. The lawmakers in Washington, sitting in their heavy, leather-upholstered chairs, realized that simply drawing an invisible, protective line on a map was not enough to keep the wilderness safe. They needed men on the ground. They needed a presence that commanded a deep, silent respect. And so, the Secretary of the Interior made a deliberate historical request to the Secretary of War. On a warm, incredibly still day in August of 1886, the slow, rhythmic sound of approaching hoofbeats began to echo through the deep canyons of the Yellowstone River. It was a heavy, perfectly synchronized sound, the unmistakable cadence of the United States Cavalry. Under the command of Captain Moses Harris, Company M of the 1st United States Cavalry rode slowly into the massive steaming caldera. Imagine the hypnotic, soothing rhythm of their arrival. 50 men, dressed in deep, heavy navy blue wool tunics and sky blue trousers with a single sharp yellow stripe down the leg. They rode two abreast, a long, magnificent column of men and horses moving seamlessly through the tall, sweet-smelling sagebrush. The only sounds were the soft, muffled thuds of iron horseshoes striking the dusty earth, the gentle, metallic jingling of brass spurs and bridle chains, and the slow, heavy breathing of the massive cavalry steeds. They brought with them a profound, highly disciplined order, a structured, quiet authority that settled over the chaotic landscape like a heavy, calming blanket. The soldiers established their camp at the base of the massive, perfectly layered terraces of Mammoth Hot Springs. They pitched heavy white canvas tents in neat, perfectly aligned rows. At night, the camp was a masterpiece of absolute tranquility. The horses were tethered in a long, quiet line, their heads drooping as they slept, standing up in the cool mountain air. The sentries walked their post with a slow, deliberate pace, their heavy leather boots crunching softly on the gravel. The warm, mineral-rich water from the hot springs cascaded down the travertine terraces just behind the camp, creating a continuous, soothing splash that acted as a natural lullaby for the exhausted soldiers. They would lie in their wool blankets, staring up at the dense, glittering canopy of the Milky Way, listening to the deep, resonant hoot of a great horned owl echoing through the ancient dark timber. As the years slowly rolled by, the temporary canvas tents were replaced by solid, permanent structures, and Fort Yellowstone was born. The buildings were painted a soft, uniform gray, with deeply sloping bright red tin roofs designed to shed the massive, crushing weight of the winter snows. The cavalrymen settled into a slow, rhythmic routine of preservation. They were not there to fight a war. They were there to stand as the quiet, steadfast guardians of the Earth's most astonishing geological secrets. They rode out on long, slow patrols, moving silently through the geyser basins, ensuring that the fragile, colorful thermal pools were left completely undisturbed. They approached the tourists with a calm, polite, but absolute authority, instructing them in soft voices to step back from the delicate crusts of the hot springs and to leave their firearms safely locked away in their wagons. But the true mesmerizing test of the cavalry's endurance came when the brief, brilliant flash of summer faded and the long, suffocating grip of the Yellowstone winter descended upon the park. The tourists would pack their bags and flee back to the noisy, crowded warmth of the East Coast, leaving the soldiers entirely alone in a frozen, deeply isolated world. The winter in the high country is not merely a season. It is an absolute, overwhelming state of being. The temperature routinely plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. The snow fell in relentless heavy curtains, burying the roads, the trails, and the valleys under 8 to 10 feet of pristine, dazzling white powder. To patrol this vast, frozen kingdom, the cavalrymen had to adapt to a terrifyingly slow and silent mode of transportation. They locked their horses away in the warm, hay-scented stables and strapped long, heavy wooden skis to their leather boots. Back then they called them snowshoes, long planks of polished hickory that allowed the men to glide smoothly over the surface of the incredibly deep snowdrifts. Imagine a solitary soldier setting out on a winter patrol. The air is so incredibly cold that it feels heavy, perfectly still, and entirely devoid of moisture. Sky is an intense, piercing shade of sapphire blue, completely devoid of a single cloud. The soldier moves with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Push, glide, push, glide. The long wooden skis make a soft, continuous shh, shh, shh sound as they slice through the powdery snow. His breath rises in thick white plumes, wrapping around his heavy wool collar before vanishing into the freezing air. He is entirely alone in a landscape that feels as though it stretches on into eternity. He glides past the frozen, completely silent waterfalls, where massive, translucent pillars of blue ice hang suspended over the dark, rushing water of the rivers. He passes the geyser basins, where the boiling subterranean heat of the earth meets the freezing atmosphere, creating massive, towering cathedrals of thick white steam that roll slowly, lazily across the frozen white plains. It is a surreal, dreamlike environment, an endless, blindingly white canvas, interrupted only by the vibrant, boiling cauldrons of the earth. These winter patrols were agonizingly slow, often lasting for weeks at a time. The men would travel from one remote, isolated log cabin to another. These snowshoe cabins were tiny, rough-hewn sanctuaries hidden deep within the dark, silent pine forests. Imagine the profound relief of reaching one of these cabins as the sun begins to slowly sink behind the jagged, snow-capped peaks, casting long, deep purple shadows across the pristine valleys. The soldier would unbuckle his heavy skis, step inside the dark, freezing cabin, and strike a single quiet match. He would light a fire in the heavy cast-iron stove, listening to the slow, comforting crackle of the dry pine logs catching flame. As the heavy iron heated up, it would emit a soft, rhythmic ticking sound, slowly pushing the bitter, bone-chilling cold out of the tiny room. The soldier would melt a pot of pure, clean snow on the stove, brew a cup of thick, strong black coffee, and sit entirely alone in the dim, warm light of a kerosene lantern. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, insulated by the massive, heavy drifts of snow piled up against the log walls. Outside, the wind might begin to howl softly through the tops of the trees, a distant, mournful lullaby that only deepened the profound sense of isolation and peace. The soldier would wrap himself in a heavy buffalo robe, the rhythmic ticking of the cooling stove and the soft sighing of the wind lulling him into a deep, heavy, and dreamless sleep. It was during these incredibly slow, frozen winter patrols that the cavalry accomplished one of their most magnificent quiet victories. Deep in the heart of the Pelican Valley, surrounded by impenetrable snow-choked mountain passes, the very last free-roaming herd of wild bison in the entire United States was quietly holding on for survival. Millions of these massive, majestic creatures had once blanketed the Great Plains, their hooves beating a continuous thundering rhythm across the continent. But by the late 1890s, they had been systematically slaughtered, leaving only a few dozen of them huddled together in the deep snows of Yellowstone, their heavy, dark brown coats standing out sharply against the blinding white landscape. The cavalrymen, moving like silent ghosts on their wooden skis, became the absolute protectors of this final fragile herd. They patrolled the boundaries of the valley with a quiet, relentless dedication, completely deterring the poachers who sought to take the last few animals. They would sit on a high, snow-covered ridge for hours, entirely motionless, watching the bison through heavy brass binoculars. They observed the massive bulls using their massive heads like snowplows, slowly, rhythmically, swinging back and forth to clear away the deep drifts so the calves could reach the frozen dry grass beneath. The soldiers watched this slow, desperate dance of survival in complete silence, understanding that if they failed, a magnificent piece of the American soul would be lost forever. Their quiet, freezing vigils paid off, and the herd slowly, miraculously began to grow, ensuring that the deep, heavy heartbeat of the buffalo would continue to echo through the valleys for generations to come. As the 19th century slowly, peacefully drew to a close, fading into the history books like the soft embers of a dying campfire, the United States cavalry had brought a profound, lasting order to the Yellowstone Plateau. They had spent 30 years living in complete harmony with the ancient sleeping giant. They had built roads that wound gently through the dark forests, designed to curve seamlessly around the natural contours of the land rather than cutting aggressively through them. They had mapped the vast, uncharted backcountry, giving quiet, respectful names to the hidden lakes and the towering mountain peaks. They had done their duty not with the loud, destructive crash of artillery, but with a slow, methodical, and deeply respectful presence. The transition into the 20th century was a gentle, almost imperceptible shift in the high country. The era of the horse-drawn stagecoach was reaching its twilight. For decades, these massive, heavy wooden coaches, painted in bright, cheerful shades of yellow and suspended on thick, swaying leather straps, had carried tourists slowly through the park. The journey was a mesmerizing, deeply rhythmic experience. The passengers would sit back against the plush leather seats, lulled into a state of continuous drowsiness by the slow, rocking motion of the coach and the steady, hypnotic clop, clop, clop of the horses' hooves on the packed dirt roads. The air was filled with the sweet, sharp scent of pine needles crushed beneath the heavy iron-rimmed wheels, and the thick, powdery dust would rise in the warm afternoon air, catching the golden sunlight in a slow, swirling dance. But soon, the quiet, mechanical hum of the very first automobiles began to echo softly through the valleys, signaling the dawn of a new, modern era. The cavalrymen, sitting on their horses, watched these strange, slow-moving machines chug gently past the steaming geysers, realizing that their time as the solitary guardians of the wilderness was slowly coming to an end. The park had grown too large, too incredibly complex, and too deeply beloved by the American public to remain under military control. It was time for a new kind of caretaker, a group of men and women specifically dedicated to the art of preservation, to step quietly into the heavy boots of the soldiers. The profound silence of the vast Yellowstone backcountry remained completely unchanged by these shifting human eras. The elk still bugled their high, haunting calls into the crisp, frosty air of the autumn mornings. The grizzly bears still wandered slowly, heavily through the wild berry patches, their massive, silver-tipped coats shining in the summer sun, before retreating into the deep, dark caves for their long 6-month slumber. The geysers, indifferent to the uniforms worn by the men who watched them, continued to build their immense subterranean pressure, the boiling water rising through the ancient plumbing of the earth with a slow, unstoppable rhythm. The stage was set for the final enduring chapter of this sleeping history. The United States government was preparing to create an entirely new organization, a completely civilian agency that would inherit the quiet, sacred trust of the national parks. They would be tasked with maintaining the delicate, beautiful balance between allowing the people to see the magic of the land while keeping the giants safely asleep, completely protected from the loud, grinding gears of modern civilization. As the first gentle light of the 20th century began to wash over the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the American West, a profound and quiet transition was slowly taking place in the deep, shaded valleys of the Yellowstone Plateau. The United States Cavalry, those steadfast and heavily disciplined men who had guarded the sleeping giant through decades of freezing winters and quiet summers, were preparing to pass the torch. The time of the soldier in the wilderness was gently drawing to a close, fading away like the last soft echoes of a brass bugle played at twilight. The men packed their heavy woolen blankets and polished their leather saddles for the final time. They led their massive, sturdy horses out of the warm, hay-scented stables of Fort Yellowstone, the iron horseshoes making a slow, rhythmic clatter on the packed dirt roads. As they rode out of the great caldera, a deep, monumental silence fell back over the land, a heavy, peaceful quiet that seemed to rise up from the very pores of the ancient geothermal earth. The American public had fallen deeply, irrevocably in love with the majestic, sweeping idea of the national parks. By 1916, there were several of these magnificent protected sanctuaries scattered across the western United States, from the towering granite walls of Yosemite to the ancient silent cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde. But they were orphans of the government, managed in a slow, disorganized patchwork by different departments with no central voice. To ensure that these vast tracts of wilderness remained perfectly preserved, shielded forever from the noisy, industrial grind of modern progress, a new, completely unified agency was desperately needed. The creation of this agency was not born in a loud, chaotic political debate, but rather it was dreamed up around the mesmerizing, glowing embers of a quiet backcountry campfire. A man named Stephen Mather, a wealthy, deeply passionate industrialist from Chicago, had traveled into the towering mountains of the West and found his soul completely captivated by the overwhelming silence of the ancient forests. He realized, with a quiet, burning certainty, that the parks needed a dedicated group of civilian protectors. Mather organized a slow, methodical journey into the wilderness, inviting a group of influential lawmakers, writers, and businessmen to ride with him deep into the high country. It became known as the Mather Mountain Party. Imagine the deep, hypnotic tranquility of those evenings. After a long day of riding slowly on horseback through the fragrant, sun-dappled pine forests, the men would make camp beside a completely still, crystal-clear alpine lake. The surface of the water was like a massive piece of polished dark glass, reflecting the brilliant, heavy canopy of the western stars. The men, exhausted and entirely removed from the stressful, noisy demands of their city lives, would sit on heavy logs around a gently crackling fire. The wood smoke would drift lazily up into the cold night air, carrying the sweet, comforting scent of burning cedar. Mather would speak in a slow, soothing, and incredibly persuasive voice. He did not yell or demand. He simply let the absolute majesty of the surrounding wilderness do the convincing. As the men listened to the distant, mournful call of a lone timber wolf and felt the deep, ancient vibration of the earth beneath their boots, they understood. They realized that this profound peace was the national treasure, far more valuable than any gold or timber. On a warm, exceptionally quiet day in August of 1916, President Woodrow Wilson sat at his heavy, polished mahogany desk in the White House. The windows were open, allowing a soft, late summer breeze to gently rustle the heavy velvet curtains. The chaotic noises of Washington, D.C. seemed miles away. Placed carefully on the desk before him was the National Park Service Organic Act. It was a beautiful, meticulously crafted document outlining a completely new mandate for the American government to conserve the scenery, the natural and historic objects, and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them completely unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. The president picked up his pen. The room was perfectly still, save for the slow, hypnotic, metronomic ticking of a tall grandfather clock standing in the corner of the office. With a few slow, deliberate strokes of dark ink, the president signed the bill into law. In that quiet, unassuming moment, the National Park Service was officially born. A massive, invisible blanket of permanent institutional protection was gently laid over millions of acres of American wilderness, ensuring that the ancient sleeping landscapes would be allowed to dream entirely undisturbed until the end of time. Out in the sprawling, majestic expanse of Yellowstone, this new era brought forth a new kind of caretaker, the National Park Ranger. These men and women were not soldiers, but deeply devoted guardians of the peace. They stepped out into the crisp, high-altitude air wearing uniforms of deep forest green and warm, earthy gray, colors deliberately chosen to blend seamlessly into the soft shadows of the lodgepole pines and the silver bark of the trembling aspens. Atop their heads sat the now iconic, broad-brimmed flat hat, designed to shield their eyes from the blinding golden rays of the western sun and to shed the heavy, continuous rains of the spring thunderstorms. The life of an early Yellowstone Ranger was a masterclass in profound, rhythmic solitude. They lived in tiny, rough-hewn log cabins perched on the edges of massive, completely silent valleys. Their days were governed not by the harsh, ringing bells of a factory or the frantic ticking of a wristwatch, but by the slow, majestic turning of the earth. They woke when the sky turned a soft, bruised purple in the east, the morning mist hanging heavy and thick over the boiling rivers. They saddled their horses, the heavy leather creaking with a comforting, familiar sound, and rode out on long, slow patrols. They moved like quiet shadows through the backcountry. They rode past the massive, towering columns of steam rising from the geyser basins, watching as the boiling water cascaded perfectly over the delicate, silica-crusted terraces. They checked on the massive, slow-moving herds of bison, watching the massive animals graze rhythmically, their heavy jaws chewing the sweet prairie grass with a steady, hypnotic cadence. When they encountered tourists, who were now arriving in greater numbers, the rangers spoke in soft, deeply knowledgeable voices. They gathered small crowds around the edge of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, pointing out the brilliant rusted colors of the sheer rock walls and explaining the incredibly slow, million-year process of the river carving its way through the stone. They were the gentle interpreters of the earth's deepest mysteries, translating the slow, heavy language of the geology into stories that captivated the minds and calmed the spirits of the weary city dwellers. As the 1920s and 1930s rolled softly across the continent, the way people experienced the park underwent a slow, fascinating transformation. The era of the horse-drawn stagecoach completely gave way to the gentle, mechanical hum of the automobile. To accommodate the massive influx of visitors, the Yellowstone Park Company introduced a fleet of magnificent bright yellow touring buses. These beautiful open-top vehicles, affectionately known as yellow jammers, because of the way the drivers had to gently jam the manual gears into place, became a beloved, iconic symbol of the park. Imagine being a passenger in one of those heavy, comfortable buses on a warm, lazy afternoon in July. The canvas roof has been completely rolled back, allowing the brilliant, piercing blue sky of Wyoming to serve as your canopy. You settle deeply into the soft, thick leather seats, feeling the gentle, rhythmic vibration of the massive engine humming beneath the floorboards. The bus moves incredibly slowly, cruising at a relaxed, unhurried pace of 15 miles per hour along the winding paved roads. The driver, a young ranger in a crisp green uniform, speaks through a small megaphone, his voice a steady, soothing drone that blends perfectly with the soft rustle of the wind passing over the windshield. The bus leans gently into a long, sweeping curve, carrying you through a dense, deeply shaded forest of ancient pine trees. The air in the forest is incredibly cool, heavy with the sweet, intoxicating scent of pine sap and damp, rich earth. The sunlight filters down through the thick, green canopy in long, dusty shafts, creating a mesmerizing, flickering pattern of light and shadow that plays across your tired eyes. The rhythmic motion of the bus, the low, steady hum of the tires on the asphalt, and the profoundly fresh, clean air create an almost overwhelming sense of drowsiness. Your eyelids begin to feel incredibly heavy, drooping downward as you watch the dark trunks of the trees slide slowly, hypnotically, past the window. Suddenly, the trees part, and the bus rolls out into the blinding, magnificent sunlight of the upper geyser basin. The driver brings the heavy vehicle to a slow, gentle halt. The air brakes, releasing with a soft, quiet hiss. You step off the bus, your boots crunching softly on the wooden boardwalks that weave carefully through the thermal area. The ground beneath you feels warm, radiating a deep, ancient heat up through the soles of your shoes. The air is thick with bright, white steam, carrying that familiar earthy scent of subterranean sulfur. You walk slowly to the edge of the wooden viewing platform, joining a quiet, hushed crowd of people who are all staring out at a massive, barren mound of gray, mineral-stained rock. The park rangers have gently informed everyone that Old Faithful is due to erupt at any moment. The anticipation in the crowd is thick, but it is a calm, peaceful anticipation. No one is rushing. No one is shouting. Everyone is completely surrendered to the absolute, unstoppable schedule of the earth. You watch closely as the geyser begins its slow, ancient breathing process. First, a few small splashes of crystal-clear boiling water spill gently over the rim, making a soft, hissing sound as they hit the hot rock. Then, the ground beneath your feet gives a low, deep shudder, a heavy vibration that you can feel deep in your chest. The breathing of the geyser grows louder, a rhythmic surging sound like the crashing of heavy ocean waves on a distant beach. The water pulses upward, dropping back down, then pulsing slightly higher. It is a mesmerizing, hypnotic dance of pressure and release. And then, with a magnificent, deep-throated roar, the massive column of boiling water absolutely explodes into the bright blue sky. It climbs higher and higher, reaching 150 feet into the air, a towering, majestic cathedral of pure water and steam. The crowd lets out a collective soft sigh of pure awe. You stand there completely transfixed, watching the heavy droplets of water catching the golden afternoon sun, glittering like millions of tiny falling diamonds before crashing back down to the earth in a brilliant continuous shower. The eruption lasts for several long, deeply satisfying minutes. It is a display of immense, terrifying power, yet it is so consistent, so deeply predictable that it brings a profound sense of comfort and absolute peace. The giant is just breathing, slowly and steadily, exactly as it has done for millennia. When the eruption finally, gently subsides, the water receding slowly back into the dark, hidden plumbing of the earth, the crowd disperses in quiet, hushed whispers. You climb back into the deep, soft leather seats of the yellow bus. The engine rumbles to life with a low, comforting purr, and the heavy vehicle begins its slow, rhythmic journey back through the darkening forests, carrying you gently toward the warm, glowing lights of the great wooden lodges where a soft bed and a heavy woolen blanket are waiting to completely envelop you in sleep. This incredibly slow, peaceful rhythm of preservation and observation has continued completely unbroken for over a century. Through the loud, chaotic decades of the 20th century, through world wars, economic depressions, and the frantic, dizzying rise of the digital age, the deep, sleeping history of the Yellowstone caldera has remained an absolute, unwavering anchor of tranquility in a rapidly spinning world. The United States government, keeping the quiet promise made by President Grant in that dim, fire-lit office so long ago, has successfully held the line against the encroaching noise of civilization. The park is still wild. The giant is still peacefully asleep. To truly understand the profound depth of this slumber, you must imagine the park exactly as it is right now, in the deepest, quietest hours of the winter night. Far away from the warm, lighted cabins of the rangers, far beyond the snow-covered, completely empty asphalt roads, the wilderness is wrapped in a silence so pure, so absolute, that it feels like a heavy, comforting weight settling softly upon your shoulders. The temperature has plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. The massive, towering peaks of the Absaroka Mountains are bathed in the pale, cold, hypnotic light of a full silver moon. The snow is incredibly deep, covering the sprawling valleys and the jagged canyons in a pristine, unbroken blanket of dazzling, glittering white. The millions of lodgepole pine trees stand completely motionless in the freezing air, their heavy, dark green branches bowed deeply toward the earth under the massive weight of the snow. There is no wind. There is no movement. The entire world has seemingly stopped turning, frozen perfectly in a single majestic moment of time. Deep beneath the deep white drifts, tucked away in a dark, incredibly warm cave carved into the side of a steep, rocky ridge, a massive grizzly bear is completely surrendered to the deep, heavy sleep of hibernation. The bear's massive, silver-tipped chest rises and falls with an incredibly slow, rhythmic motion. One deep breath in and a long, slow breath out. Its heartbeat, which races during the warm, chaotic days of summer, has slowed to a deep, resonant thud, beating only a few times a minute. The bear feels absolutely no cold. It feels absolutely no hunger. It is completely disconnected from the freezing, silent world outside, floating entirely peacefully in the dark, comforting void of its own deep sleep. Down in the valleys, beneath the thick blue ice of the frozen rivers, the cutthroat trout hover completely motionless in the dark, cold water, their gills moving with a slow, barely perceptible rhythm. The massive herds of bison have gathered tightly together in the lower geyser basins, utilizing the ancient subterranean heat radiating from the hot springs to survive the bitter cold. They stand together, completely still, their heavy dark coats dusted with bright white frost. The thick warm steam from the thermal vents rolls gently across the herd, wrapping the massive animals in a soft, white, hypnotic fog. They close their large, dark eyes, chewing their cud with a slow, grinding, endless rhythm, completely at peace with the freezing, silent world around them. And directly beneath all of this, beneath the sleeping bears, beneath the frost-covered bison, beneath the millions of quiet, snow-laden trees, and beneath the deeply frozen, silent lakes, the great ancient supervolcano continues its incredibly slow, eternal respiration. The massive, unimaginable chamber of molten magma lying miles beneath the crust of the earth pulses with a deep, heavy heat. It is a slow, continuous fire that warms the underground rivers, creating the endless rhythmic pressure that drives the geysers. The earth here is literally breathing. It breathes through the slow bubbling rhythm of the mud pots, which pop and hiss with a heavy, thick sound, like a massive pot of oatmeal simmering gently on a very low fire. It breathes through the deep sapphire blue thermal pools, the incredibly hot water rising slowly from the dark, bottomless vents, rippling the glassy surface with a soft, hypnotic motion. And it breathes through Old Faithful, which continues to erupt into the freezing, empty winter night, sending its majestic, boiling column of water hundreds of feet into the moonlight, playing its magnificent symphony of steam and water completely to an audience of stars. As you lie there now, perfectly still in the quiet, comforting darkness of your own room, you can almost feel the slow, heavy vibration of that ancient subterranean heartbeat. Let your mind drift slowly westward, away from the loud, chaotic noises of your daily life, away from the bright screens and the ringing phones, and travel deeply into the vast, absolute silence of the American wilderness. Feel the incredible heavy weight of your own body sinking deeply into the soft mattress, exactly like the heavy, powdery snow settling softly onto the branches of the ancient pine trees. Let the soft, incredibly warm blankets wrap completely around you, mimicking the thick, comforting clouds of white steam rising gently from the hot springs, shielding you entirely from the cold, busy world outside. Notice the slow, rhythmic rising and falling of your own chest. Match your breathing to the slow, deep, hypnotic breathing of the sleeping grizzly bear in its dark, warm den. Inhale slowly, drawing in the crisp, clean, deeply pine-scented air of the high mountains. Exhale slowly, letting go of every ounce of tension in your muscles, letting it completely evaporate into the quiet night, just like the warm breath of the elk turning instantly to soft white mist in the freezing air. Your eyelids are incredibly heavy now, sinking downward with the exact same slow, unstoppable momentum as the golden sun dipping gently behind the jagged purple peaks of the Rocky Mountains. The light of the day is completely gone, replaced entirely by a vast, comforting, deeply protective darkness. The noises of the world have faded away into a soft, continuous rushing whisper, like the wind moving gently through millions of silent, sleeping trees. The story of the Yellowstone caldera, the sleeping giant of the American West, is a profound reminder that the Earth is not always in a rush. It took millions of years for the glaciers to slowly, patiently carve the deep, echoing canyons. It took tens of thousands of years for the hot springs to slowly, meticulously build their delicate, perfectly cascading terraces of brilliant white stone. The Earth operates on a time frame so incredibly massive, so deeply, profoundly slow, that human worries and human anxieties simply dissolve into absolute nothingness against it. The history of this land is entirely finished with its loud, violent, volcanic beginnings. It has settled completely into a state of permanent, protected tranquility. The cavalry soldiers have long since ridden away into the history books. The early explorers have closed their leather journals and drifted off to sleep. The Native Americans, who walked completely silently across the obsidian glass, have left the land exactly as they found it. All that remains now is the profound, overwhelming peace of the sanctuary, carefully guarded by the quiet rangers in the green uniforms, completely preserved so that it can continue to sleep completely undisturbed forever. There is nothing left for you to do. There are no more trails to slowly hike, no more mountains to gently climb, and no more history to quietly uncover. The journey is completely over. The campfire has slowly burned down to soft gray glowing embers, the heat radiating gently into the cool night air. The deep, heavy silence of the wilderness has completely surrounded you, seeping into your mind, slowing your thoughts to a gentle, lazy crawl. Listen to the slow, rhythmic, completely unstoppable heartbeat of the earth. Let it pull you down, deeper and deeper, into a vast, heavy, and dreamless slumber. The giant is completely asleep beneath the snow. The forest is completely asleep beneath the stars. And now, as the soft, whispering winds of the high country blow gently through your mind, it is time for you to sleep, completely safe, completely calm, and completely at peace.